you ask.
I have to wear it every day. Despise these things.
Amen to that.
Okay, I am speaking from James. James chapter 3 today. Chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. I'm going to read it real quick. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. If you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Let me just bow in order. Father, we just thank you for your word. Just pray that you would give me the ability to communicate what you're saying, and that we can take it into our hearts and put it into practice in our lives. In Jesus' name. So in 2012, some of you might remember this, there was a guy named Fearless Felix, and he made a death-defying jump out of a balloon that was more than 24 miles above the earth. On the way down, he hit speeds literally of over 800 miles an hour. After spinning out of control at the beginning of his jump, his landing was picture perfect. He had broken the sound barrier. He had broken all kinds of records with this jump. And over the years, he said, probably over 2,500 jumps. He told reporters afterwards that that was probably going to be his last one. After doing something like that, he said there's probably not much more left to try. I guess not. And here's what he said in an interview, quote, "When I was standing there on top of the world, you become so humble. You don't think about breaking records anymore. You don't think about gaining scientific data. The only thing you want is to come back alive. Sometimes you have to get really high to see how really small we are." So I wonder, do we see a big God when we look at him? Do we see how big God really is? I mean, think about it. He created the world and everything that we see with just a word. We exist because he exists. Scripture tells us that. We exist because he exists. We exist in the mind of God. He always was and always will be. He never had a beginning. Wrap your mind around that. He's everywhere at the same time. He has unlimited power, unlimited knowledge. How can that not humble us? Especially add to the fact that for some reason, he loves us. He even tells us, "I know the numbers of hair on your head." I don't know that. You know that? I don't know that. And he knows it. Last week we learned how to be wise with our words because our tongue has the power to direct our lives for good or bad. So I'm wondering, did you watch your words this week? Hopefully you, as I have, I kind of took that to heart. And I really have been working at holding my words and making them kind. One of the main things that James is teaching us in his letter is that if we say something, if we say we believe it, it should be fleshed out in our actions. So we come to the question that James asked in James 3:13 that underlines this truth. And he said, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" Who is wise and understanding among you? You know, the more knowledge we have, you would think we would be wiser, but that's not necessarily the case. And we have more knowledge at our fingertips today than ever before. Years ago, Google CEO Eric Schmidt, he made this statement when he was at Google at 2010. He made this. Every 2 days, we now create as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003. Every 2 days. Now that was literally 10 years ago, so I'm guessing that it's sped up a long ways from there. We're literally living in a time where information is exploding and it's immediately accessible to our phones, our tablets, our computers. But here's the question. With all this knowledge and information, do you think we're any wiser? The Bible is all about us becoming wise and understanding. And Proverbs 1:7 gives us the key that unlocks the way to wisdom. And it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. The main emphasis of the entire Bible is really about fearing the Lord. And in this particular verse here in Proverbs, there's two kinds of people, those who fear the Lord and the fools who don't. And the beginning of knowledge refers to its origin, or the principal part, those who fear the Lord. A fool is not just someone who is a couple bricks shy of a load, whose elevator doesn't go to the top, a few fries short of a Happy Meal. In Proverbs, the fool is the person that doesn't follow God's way. He's the one who knows the right thing to do, but instead does the opposite, or simply does nothing. Proverbs 1:32 says that the complacency of fools will destroy them. In the New Testament, the contrast between the believer and the unbeliever, the saved and the lost, those in the light and those who walk in the darkness. Wisdom doesn't come just because we get older, right? We all know that. I look around, most of us, we're not in our beginning years. We know we have experience in life. And we know that doesn't bring necessarily wisdom. We get it when we go after it. That's the bottom line. We get wisdom when we go after wisdom. There's a saying, we can only be young once, but we can be immature indefinitely. Proverbs 4:7 says, wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom. Though it cost you all you have, get understanding. Proverbs 8:11, for wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her. You and I can become wise by following what James says in chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Let's look at the second half of that James chapter 3, verse 13 verse. Obviously, knowledge and education is not enough. It's not enough just to claim to be wise and to be understanding or understand something. We have to show it by how we live. And he says, let him show it by his good life. That's what James says. Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. To show it is called an empathic imperative, and it goes along with James 2:18. It means, I will show you my faith by what I do. Knowledge comes from books. Wisdom comes from the book. Knowledge is the accumulation of facts, but wisdom is the God-given ability to apply them to every situation that we encounter. And the true test of wisdom is works, not necessarily words. A lot of us can talk good talk. James is saying walk, good walk. The phrase good life in that passage can be translated a beautiful lifestyle. Unfortunately, the good life for many people is wrapped up in possessions and power and in popularity and in pleasure. And notice that we demonstrate wisdom by the way we live and how we act with humility. That's what he said, with humility. Humility is not weakness, it actually is strength under control. So in our passage today, we'll see two kinds of wisdom. There's a wisdom that comes from above, and there's a wisdom that comes from below. And only the humble of heart are going to be the right place to receive it. James makes a contrast between the two, wisdom from below and wisdom from above. So first of all, let's talk about the origins. Where does this wisdom come from? Where does it come from? Wisdom from below. In verse 15 of the passage that we read, James says, such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly and spiritually of the devil. This triad of enemies is also called the world, the flesh, and the devil. Ephesians 2:1-3 talks about that. And James starts with the least, moves to the worst, and he says, first of all, it's earthly. And earthly, for most people, wisdom is measured in worldly terms. What we can scientifically take hold of, what the social media says, right? That's earthly wisdom. And then there's unspiritual wisdom. In the Greek, the word describes animals that are only concerned about their survival. The idea of being controlled by your emotions, by doing what feels right. Just because something feels right doesn't mean it is right? And again, we go back to social media. Social media is driving the conscience of so many people, and it's earthly and unspiritual wisdom that they're grabbing for. And then he says, actually, there's wisdom of the devil. And that's strong language. And it's very similar to what he said about the tongue in chapter 3, verse 6 we covered last week. He said, it itself is set on fire by hell. Strong language. Beginning in Genesis 3, when Satan urged Eve to go against God in order to become wise. Remember that story? He continues to run that path because it works. So he continues to do that. And then he said, wisdom from above is different. In verse 17, he spells out the contrast. He says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, it comes from heaven. This takes us back to chapter 1, verse 17 in James, where he says, where we read that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. Proverbs 2:6 says, for the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Here's the big difference. Wisdom from below comes from reason, social acceptance. I mean, literally, what we would have accepted years ago or not accepted years ago, we now accept readily today because of social acceptance. There's not a clear line. And that's wisdom from below. There's never a clear line. Wisdom from above comes from revelation from a God who created everything and drew that line for us. What about how they operate? We talked about the origins, where they come from, but how do these wisdoms operate? What does it look like? Their origins are vastly different, but so how they operate is as well. Number one, wisdom from below. Look at verse 14 in James 3. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not boast about it or deny the truth. In our age, especially of texting, we use LOL, right? Laugh out loud. IDK. I don't know. I don't know half of these things because I don't use those. People say, Dave, why do you have to spell everything out? I don't know all these. I heard one that says WIIFM. And I'm like, what the heck does that mean? What's in it for me? Wisdom from below is corrosive because I make everything all about me. When we're envious, we want something that somebody else has. When we're envious, we want someone, not only what they have, but we want it so much that we begin to harbor bitterness against them because they have it and we don't. Selfish ambition is all about me getting ahead. The phrase was used of people who enter politics for selfish reasons. Makes me wonder about 2020. King Saul was basically destroyed because of his bitter envy that he had toward this young man David. And I'm reminded of Proverbs 14:30. It says, a heart of peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Job 5:2, resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. Wisdom from below. Carl Erickson, a 73-year-old South Dakota man, was sentenced to life in prison after admitting to the murder of a former high school classmate. The friends and the family members, they were just shocked because this once very successful insurance man just seemed to snap. But after the murder, Erickson, his secret finally came out, and over 55 years he had been simmering and nurturing a grudge. He had been harboring this kind of envy and anger toward this, and bitterness toward this classmate because the classmate, I don't know if he was a bully or what, but he had pulled an embarrassing high school locker room prank on him when he was a teenager. A guy named Norman Johnson, the classmate and the murder victim, he was a star athlete on the track team, and Erickson was a sports manager. And the prank that they pulled, it planted seeds of resentment in Erickson's heart, and for half a century he nurtured them. And apparently throughout their lives, Norman continued to outshine Erickson in just about every way. He competed in college football, earned a degree, taught and coached at his alma mater for 3 decades. But after harboring this bitterness in his heart for so long, Carl Erickson, he rang Johnson's doorbell one day and then shot him dead. And Erickson told the judge when he was asked when this all started, he goes, I guess it was from something that happened over 50 years ago. It was apparently in my subconscious, he said. And during his sentencing, he turned back to Johnson's widow and apologized, saying, I wish I could just turn back the clock. Wisdom from above can get that way. Or wisdom from below can get that way. And then we have wisdom from above. Instead of bitter envy and selfish ambition, biblical wisdom operates very, very differently. And we see that in verse 17. It says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Worldly wisdom crowns itself. Heavenly wisdom crucifies itself. That's a huge difference. Self is up here with worldly wisdom. With godly wisdom, no. Self doesn't matter. Christ is up here. There are two main distinctives of the wisdom that comes from above. Number one, it says that it is pure and it is peace-loving. So the first thing is pure. And that's the first quality that James lists. But it's more than just first on the list. It's an essential, overarching characteristic of godly wisdom. And it refers to holiness and living totally sold out to Jesus Christ, pure. Just like Jesus said in Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. So that's the first thing about this distinctive about the wisdom from above. First of all, it's pure. And secondly, it's peace-loving. Wisdom from above is pure and it's peace-loving. Purity speaks of a person's relationship with God, and peace-loving characterizes the ability to get along with other people, which we just talked about in James chapter 2. All about getting along with other people. If you find yourself and you're always looking for a fight with someone, and I'm not talking about physical fight, I'm talking maybe verbal fight, right? But if you find yourself always on edge, always looking for a fight, maybe something's not wrong with them, maybe something's wrong with you. But if we find ourselves constantly on edge like that, something isn't right. There should be a red flag that pops up in our head. The first thing we need to do is make peace with Christ and make sure our heart's right with Him. Talk to Him about it. And then James goes on and he lists 6 other characteristics or qualities that relate to being a lover of peace. As we walk through them, take an inventory, see how you measure up. Firstly, he says, consider. Are you gentle? Are you reasonable with others? Would people say that you're harsh? Ask yourself the question. And remember, James' words prior, again, in chapter 2, it's all about our words. He says, considerate, submissive. Are you compliant? Are you approachable? Are you willing to yield to other people? Or do you always need to be right? Have things your way. Hey, you can be right or you can be happy. You can have both. He says, considerate, submissive, full of mercy. Are you compassionate with those who are hurting? Do you look for practical ways to help them? James 2, verse 15 to 16, he describes the importance of providing people with clothing, when they're in need. He says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is that? And then he also says that it's filled with good fruit. Do you see any spiritual fruit in your life? Paul has a list in Galatians 5, 22 and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Is that fruit growing in your life? We need to ask ourselves. And then he says that this wisdom from above is impartial. Do you treat the people the same? Or do you have some favorites? I know we all have favorites. But how do we treat people? Do we treat them the same? And then it says it's impartial and sincere. Sincere. Meaning what you say and saying what you mean. Would people say that you're hypocritical or you're the real deal? What would they say about you? I think those are things that we have to ask ourselves as we look at this wisdom from above, which is what we want. And thirdly, and last, what are the outcomes? What do the results look like? You know, a person can really see the difference between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom by looking at the outcomes, what they produce. Number one, wisdom from below. Worldly wisdom leads to some pretty nasty fruit, according to verse 16 of our passage in James today. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. He's not mixing words. I mean, those are strong words. And this is the second time James refers to envy and selfish ambition. Links them together. Commentator Albert Barnes, who describes what happens when these are present. He says, everything is unsettled and agitated. The word disorder, he says, describes instability and a state of chaos and confusion. Incidentally, if you're trying to do life without Jesus Christ at the center, you will not have purity and peace in your life. Remember the Tower of Babel? I don't know if you all read that story, but the people of the world, they were leaning on worldly wisdom, and so they said, let's build a tower to get to heaven. And they came together and they built this huge tower trying to get to heaven. And they were filled with pride. And God disapproved of this. He called it an evil practice. And so he scattered them simply by giving them different languages to speak. It doesn't work when we try to do things our way because we need God in our lives, and we need that forgiveness, we need that peace. And he did it for us. He didn't wait for us to come to him, he came to us in the person of Jesus Christ. Remember the truth of 1 Corinthians 14:33. It says, for God is not a God of disorder, but a God of peace. That's wisdom from below. We don't want that. We want the wisdom from above. And what are the outcomes of wisdom from above? It's given to us in verse 18. It describes how the root of godly wisdom results in some really, really attractive fruit. It says, peacemakers who sow peace raise a harvest of righteousness. I like the Phillips paraphrase version. It says, and the wise are peacemakers who go on quietly sowing a harvest of righteousness in other people and in themselves. Here's the challenge for each of us today. let's plant in other people this week. Let's plant in other people this week. But first we have to be at peace with ourselves. When God grows purity and peace in us, we can then begin to go and plant it in other people. Some of us, we need to work on us first. And then allow that just to ooze out, and it will overflow to the people around us. If the root is right, the fruit will be right. Right? We have a choice. We can follow the ways of the world. We can follow the ways that God is talking to us about here in James and his wisdom. Isaiah 32:17 says, the fruit of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quietness and confidence forever. In 1930, the Chicago Examiner ran a very strange story. It was about a man named Harry Havens. He went to bed and he stayed there for 7 years with a blindfold over his eyes because he was angry with his wife. He was the kind of husband who liked to help around the house, and then one day, as he was helping around the house, his wife, I guess, just got ticked at him, and she scolded him and yelled at him for the way he did the dishes. And Harry got so angry, he said, all right, if that's the way you feel, I'm going to bed. I'm going to stay there for the rest of my life, and I don't want to see you ever again. So he stayed in bed with a blindfold around his eyes for 7 years. And the article concluded by saying that he got up when the bed started to feel uncomfortable. Crazy. But are you blinded by any bitterness in your life today? Do you have any unresolved anger toward maybe a husband, a wife, a kid, a parent, a boss, a friend? The Bible makes it clear that we have to do everything that it takes not to let that root of bitterness grow in the soil of our souls. Hebrews 12:15 says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. When bitterness is allowed to breed, it breeds well. And it always leads to an offspring of antagonism that hurts everybody around us in the process. And actually, the truth is it hurts us more than anything because we're allowing it to grow in our hearts. It's kind of like swallowing a bottle of poison and then waiting for the other person to die. Ken Sande talks about 3 ways that people deal with conflict. He said some try to escape it, that's peace faking. Others try to go into attack mode, that's peace breaking. While a few try to implement true reconciliation, that's peacemaking. Since Jesus pronounces a blessing on us to be peacemakers, we need to strive to rip out those ugly, bitter roots from our hearts and become the kind of peacemakers he wants us to be. If bitterness has put us in bed, it's led you to a place you don't want to be. And here are some ways to get back on our feet again. First, confess your sins to God about how you've wronged him, about you wronged others. We find that in 1 John 1:9. So come to God, basically, is what I'm saying, and make peace with him. Second, own up to your part of the conflict by getting the log out of your own eye. Remember that passage, Luke 6:42. Right? Make peace with God, get the log out of your own eye. Okay? Admit your part. Admit you're wrong. Third, cherish how much God's given us forgiveness in Jesus Christ. Colossians 3:13. And I guarantee that you begin to dwell on that and figure out how much you've been forgiven, it changes how we treat other people. Fourth, actively forgive those who have wronged you by setting them free from ever having to pay you back. Ephesians 4:32. That's hard. You're not expecting anything when you pray that. You're forgiving them, you're letting them off the hook. Why? Because you're choosing to. Not because they deserve it, because you're choosing to let them off the hook. Just like Jesus let you off the hook. And fifth, trust in God's judgment, or justice. Romans 12:19. We don't hold the grudge. Because when we hold the grudge, we end up being the judge. And that's God's place. That's not our place. So we let God be the judge. We let go of the grudge. We can become bitter, or we can become better. That's our choice. James 3:18 says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. It doesn't make a distinction whether it's male or female, whether it's old or young. It just says peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. What a legacy. What a legacy. So if you're feeling a little bit bitter today about something that was said about you or done to you, remember that Jesus paid for all his wrongs already. That all those sins have been forgiven, and that is the good news. And as usual, it comes back to Jesus Christ. Because of what he did, we can be peacemakers. And so a harvest of righteousness. So as we go to communion today, think about what James has said to us. He said, have a wisdom from above. Become a peacemaker.